Hi everybody, it's 9 o'clock and 9 o'clock is with me, Father Warner. We are in Wednesday of the 11th week in Ordinary Time. Our text is taken from 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 1 and then 6 to 14. And I've entitled today's teaching, Chariots of Fire. So let's look at the text today and then I will explain it to you and also give you a bit of context of what to expect tomorrow when we go to the book of Sirach, just an one-off reading from the book of Sirach and then we go back again to study 2 Kings. So, now when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to the other side, to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended in a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in 2 pieces. He picked up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" When he had struck the water was parted to one side and to the other, and Elisha went on. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, the readings of the liturgy have moved from 1 Kings to the 2nd book of Kings. I want to remind you, perhaps, I don't know whether I did it earlier, but just to remind you that in the Hebrew Old Testament, these 2 books were actually one book. 1 and 2 Kings are really a single book that was broken into 2 parts because it was just too long for a single scroll. Thus, there is no real break between the 2 books as 1 book and 2 books. Technically, there's no break, it is one continuous book. We simply move from the death of Ahab in the 1st book of Kings in chapter 22 to the death of his son Ahaziah in 2 Kings chapter 1. Now, the book of Kings, when I speak of the book of Kings, I mean both book 1 and 2. The book of Kings covers a period of approximately 4 centuries. It begins with David's old age and Solomon's accession to the throne. This happened about 960 BC, and then the book ends with the fall in the exile of Judah, which happens in 587 to roughly about 586 BC in those years, 587, 586. Now, it covers therefore 3 major periods in the life of Israel and in the life of the nation of Judah. If you look at the book, 1 Kings chapter 1 to 11 covers the reign of Solomon. We have not studied that section because when we began looking at the book of Kings, we started from chapter 17 of 1 Kings. Then 1 Kings chapter 12 to 2 Kings chapter 17 covers the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. Remember that after Solomon's death, the kingdom of of Israel was divided into two parts: Israel to the north, consisting of 10 tribes, and Judah to the south, consisting of 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Then 2 Kings, chapter 18 to 25, the last part of 2 Kings, covers Judah after the fall of Israel in the year 721 BC. So, where are we today? We are in the second part of this long book, which, as I said, totally, if you put them together, comprises of 47 chapters. Now, the passage of today focuses on the departure of the prophet Elijah. Elijah is one of the only 2 people in the Old Testament who does not die. The other is Enoch. And Enoch, we are told, walks with God and is then taken by God. You can read this in Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. Now, this really is the end of a remarkable ministry of the prophet Elijah, one that was in many ways similar to the ministry of Moses. You can see right till the bitter end, he strikes the river Jordan with his mantle, very similar to Moses striking the Red Sea with his staff. Yet often we see a marked difference between Moses and Elijah the prophet. Elijah often seemed more concerned with his own disappointments and frustrations than with the people he was to be involved with. We saw this in 1 Kings. He literally tells the Lord, I am the only one faithful, the rest have not been faithful, let me die. It just comes to that. He's very involved in his own, sometimes in his own good name. Now, even after a very direct encounter which we saw in 1 Kings between God and Elijah in the cave at Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is also Mount Sinai, and this incident was very reminiscent of Moses' own encounter there. You see that Elijah does not become an advocate for the Israelites like Moses did. Moses was an advocate for the Israelite people. Sadly, Elijah chooses to remain, in that sense, a judge, in fact, a very determined judge, to the point, as I said, where he tells the Lord, nobody else has been faithful. And then God had to remind Elijah, well, you're wrong. There were people like Obadiah. There were the 7,000 remnant that did not bow to Baal. Elijah, you're not the only one. There were others too. So finally, to the several appeals that Elijah makes to God to let him die, and we see this in 1 Kings chapter 19, 16, finally God in chapter 19 decides to replace Elijah with Elisha. And this is the moment when the transition of prophetic power first begins. If you remember what I said last week, it's also the moment when God now begins to hand over the northern and the southern kingdom, both in time, to foreign nations, because Elijah was sent to anoint the king of Syria. So, 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 1, from where our text begins, locates Elijah and Elisha at a place called Gilgal. Now, we didn't do the entire text because we went to chapter 2 verse 1 and then we jumped to verse 6. Verses 1 to 10, if you look at them together, are preliminary and preparatory ways in which Elijah is now going to leave us. It's his exodus. There is no mystery that Elijah's departure is imminent. It's very clear that it's going to happen. The chapter itself begins with the announcement in chapter 2 verse 1, the announcement that the Lord is about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. Now watch this. Most art forms will have Elijah in a chariot on fire. If you listen very carefully, as I will say again, the chariot of fire, at least in 2 Kings, separates Elijah and Elisha, and then Elijah is taken in a whirlwind. But you'll see in tomorrow's reading from the book of Sirach, it mentions both the whirlwind and it mentions Elijah being taken up by in a chariot of fire. So that's where you'll see several paintings, even that of Peter Paul Rubens is a beautiful painting, of Elijah being taken up in a chariot. So in any case, Elijah's life has been stormy, and his departure will be as dramatic as ever and as stormy as ever, with fire and chariots, etc. That's why I called this teaching today the Chariots of Fire, also remembering that fantastic movie. Now, however, the passage of today is also meant to focus on Elisha, because you see a disciple's faithfulness to his leader. It's also about the passing of the prophetic mantle from Elijah to Elisha. So the narratives also confirm that Elisha had inherited the prophetic office and the power of this great prophet Elijah. In fact, he asks him today, he says, please let me inherit a double share of your spirit. And Elijah straight away says, you have asked for a very hard thing. Now, I wonder why Elijah said you asked for a very hard thing. Did he think that this is a tough job, Elisha? Do you really know what you're asking for? Or was he very reluctant to even give up his post till the end? We don't know. We can only second guess. But this we can say, that the transfer of leadership can produce tension and anxiety in any community, in any country, in any religious house, even in an office. A transition of power is always not a smooth thing. We hope it would be. We've seen even the last presidential election in America. Well, it wasn't as easy as it is. They're still having congressional inquiries into what went on. But that's another thing. Let's not get into politics or geopolitics. But this was certainly the case with Elijah and Elisha, and because there was a sense of tension. If one can really read through the text, there seems to be some kind of tension. It wasn't as smooth as the transition we would have thought it would be. Now, the previously unknown prophet Elisha doesn't take over immediately, but instead he begins to serve as what we would call a prophet in training, not a prophet in waiting, but a prophet in training. It's not that he just waited for his moment to come. He is a prophet in training, and he also becomes, in that sense, the prophet Elijah's very loyal companion, even though thrice in chapter 2 verse 1 to 10 Elijah will tell him, the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel. Then he says, the Lord has sent me as far as the Jordan. The Lord has sent me as far as Jericho. Leave me. Each time Elisha, the prophet Elisha, will say, no, I will not leave you. He says, I will not leave you. You can see this again and again. I will not leave you. I will not leave you. Thrice he says, I will not leave you. So he becomes Elijah's very loyal companion. Perhaps it is for this reason that the second book of Kings in chapter 2 describes, as I just said, a very strange journey that Elijah intended. He intended first to travel alone without Elisha. On this journey from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho and then to Jordan, to the Jordan River, yet each time Elisha, the prophet, refuses to leave his master Elijah until the last possible moment, always traveling with him. Now, each time Elisha sets out, each time Elijah sets out, he gives Elisha orders, as I said, to stay back. And each time Elisha refuses to stay back and leave his master alone. Now, every time they come to their destination, and you'll see this in the text, they also are met by a school of prophets. And each time they are met by these prophets, Elisha is told by these prophets that this is the day the Lord will take your master away from him. Elisha responds by telling these prophets that he knows that Elijah is to be taken from him. And he says, why don't you just be silent? Okay, finally, Elijah departs, and he departs in what a spectacular fashion. We are told Elijah was taken up to heaven in the whirlwind. Remember I said, not in the chariot of fire and horses of fire, which in this text we are told the chariot and horses of fire came between the two of them and cut them off from human sight. Elijah is now not to be seen. He is never seen again until the transfiguration of Jesus, almost 1,000 years later. Elisha, who witnesses his master's departure, is upset. we are told he tears his clothing. Why does one do that? It was done as a sign of mourning. Of course, it was also done as a sign of blasphemy, but it was done in this case as a sign of mourning. Elisha has lost his mentor. He's lost, in that sense, his closest friend. He's lost his traveling companion. Now, the responsibility for prophecy will fall entirely on the prophet Elisha's shoulders. So, with his double portion of blessing that he has already received from Elijah, Elisha picks up Elijah's fallen mantle, we are told, and before those 50 prophets who are watching on the other side of the Jordan, he uses the mantle of Elijah and he splits the water of the Jordan in two. This, as I said, is reminiscent of Moses at the Red Sea. It's very reminiscent of what Elijah just did. So at Yahweh's direction also, you'll remember that Moses lifted up the staff and he stretched it out over the water and he divided the water so that the Israelites could cross over the sea onto dry ground. So therefore, Elisha, in doing what Moses did, what Elijah did, is now clearly demonstrating his right as a successor. And Elisha crosses to take his place as the prophet among prophets in Elijah's stead. Elisha's ability to part the water confirms now that he has those prophetic powers that Elijah has. He has now truly received, in that sense, a double portion of the spirit of Elijah. Elisha has been faithful to stay with Elijah and to faithfully watch for this transition to take place. He would be the one to take on the responsibility now of his mentor. How many times, and think about this, do believers miss God's will because we become so preoccupied with our problems, with other people, with our successes, you name it, we are so preoccupied. Elisha could have been preoccupied or occupied with himself and the new position as prophet that he had, the position of authority, the position of responsibility that he has now received or was to receive at that point of time. But his response, as seen in the words he cried out as he saw Elijah pass from the scene, demonstrates a different heart, one that exposes this young prophet's heart and a perspective really about life itself. Elisha and Elijah also mark, in that sense, a transition in Israelite prophecy. Unlike those before them who fulfill prophetic responsibilities as part of their larger callings, people such as Moses and Deborah and Samuel, Elijah and Elisha were called to be a new kind of prophet. They operated completely outside the system with no official recognition, no compensation. In fact, they become enemies of the kings literally because of the prophetic voice, because of what they say so strongly. In 1 Kings chapter 13 all the way down to 2 Kings chapter 17, these two prophets marked out careers in which they performed miracles and healings and called Israel and its leaders to task, and sometimes even by very violent means. Tomorrow we will study a section from the book of Sirach. If I'm not mistaken, it's chapter 48, and that will be in a way a poetic way. The book of Sirach is taken from the apocryphal section of the book of the Old Testament. It's a way of bringing honor to Elijah. It's like you want to close one section on Elijah, so we look at the book of Sirach, and there in chapter 48, among many other leaders in Israel, the writer of the book of Sirach will pay glowing tributes to Elijah. Was Elijah perfect? As we said, no. But sometimes it's better to end a person's ministry, a person's career, with good words rather than point out only their weaknesses. We don't do this at a eulogy at a funeral, much less would we do this with a great prophet like Elijah. I do hope you love this, this new series that we are doing. It gives you an insight into the sometimes a little more difficult part of the Bible to read, the Old Testament. But once you understand Israelite history, which I take some trouble to explain, once you understand the mind of the author of these books, then you begin to see how God is working through his prophets, working through his people, and sometimes taking a very tough stance. I want to leave you with this thought today. May the Lord bless you. May he guide your day. Don't forget to like this video, to share it with your friends. I want to thank you, many of you who wished me on the Feast of St. Anthony. Many of you enjoyed the talk that we had on St. Anthony. Also give me your reactions to the new series that we are doing at 4 o'clock on Sundays, which is entitled Why Do Catholics? So thank you to all those also who contribute to the Love, Joy, Hope Foundation. If you want to sponsor a meal for the children of this foundation in Goa, you can just send me a WhatsApp message on 98202-42151. There's a lot of information also I've got to give you. The kids have come back to our home. They take a summer break, so they're all back, and Lenny and Nadia also are working very closely with the CWC, the Child and Women's Commission. They have been visiting the home and interviewing the children. We want to follow the legal process that is laid down by government laws. So thank you everybody for taking care of the children as part of this ministry, and also to those of you who support this ministry by your generous donations. God bless you. Have a lovely day. I'll see you tomorrow, 9 o'clock with Father Warner.